regard to conceptual weaknesses, we would say that the report provides an incomplete historiography of US S&T policy development, that it in fact, in some ways, misreads the nature of global competition. From a methodological perspective, we find the report to underemphasize what are actually some very worrying results contained within the actual report. We found that the report failed to include certain key measures, and that in several cases, it was not basing its analysis on the most recently available data. With regard to the first point, throughout the report, the authors bring to bear a number of arguments that either call into question the principle of international competitiveness in science and technology, or to suggest that perhaps previous calls for concern that arose in the 1960s with regard to Sputnik and in the 1980s with regard to competitiveness challenges from Japan and Europe, to say, well, those weren't really real crises. Everything turned out to be fine. So there really wasn't a need for any real deep proactive government involvement. But what we find is that, in fact, previous challenges to US science and technology competitiveness were in fact real. They were in fact met head-on with proactive reforms to US science and technology policies that have been instrumental in sustaining US preeminence in science and technology over the past 30 years. So if you go back to the 1960s and look at our coordinated, concerted response to the Soviet challenge with Sputnik, we created the National Defense Education Act. We dramatically expanded funding for research and development in the country. In the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a whole host of policy initiatives that were introduced in response to the Japanese competitiveness challenge. These included the Bayh-Dole Act, creating the Advanced Technology Program and the Manufacturing Extension Programs within the Department of Commerce, launching Cimatech to help maintain US competitiveness in the semiconductor industry, establishing the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, and implementing the R&D tax credit, which was at the time the world's most generous tax credit. So within the report, the authors don't really focus on what we have adjusted in the past to respond to competitive threats. Secondly, we found the report misreads the nature of global competition. So the first argument they make here is to cite Paul Krugman and this neoclassical argument that, the idea that nations compete is really incorrect. Countries aren't like corporations and are not to any important degree in economic competition with each other. Well, that seems odd as a theory, but what Krugman and neoclassical economists might argue is that, in fact, international trade is not a zero-sum game. So all countries benefit through trade. As foreign markets grow, the US benefits because we are able to import cheaper, more efficient products into our country, and we grow because international export markets are increased for US companies. So international trade is ultimately beneficial to the US in that regard. And moreover, since 90% of an economy is non-traded, it's really the growth rate of domestic productivity and not US productivity relative to international competitors that truly matters. But this argument has some real problems. First, it underestimates the importance that high value added output provides to an economy, especially through spillover effects. It focuses mostly on the growth effect, which is across the board economic productivity growth, and undercounts the mix effect, which is shifts within an economy in the mix of industries and firms to more productive ones. And it undercounts it because a predominant share of high value added sectors turn out to exist in traded international markets, like science, like information technology. Finally, this neoclassical argument reflects the bias of computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? The idea that $100 worth of semiconductor microprocessor exports is the same as $100 worth of manufacturing of potato chips, which ultimately implies that what a country makes really doesn't matter, and so countries can be comfortable being indifferent to their industrial value added mix. Well, the problem with this argument is that spillover and network effects mean that some industries are crucially important to an economy. So computer chips, or microprocessors, semiconductors, have the effect of sparking the development of subsequent downstream industries, like Google and eBay and portable navigation systems. It ignores that certain industries, in fact, make other industries more efficient, so that your computer chip, semiconductor industry can ultimately make your potato chip manufacturers more efficient. And it ignores the fact that jobs in those high value added output sectors tend to be higher paying. Ultimately, if you lose the high value industries due to foreign competition, the value just disappears. The assumption that a neoclassical trade model makes that resources can be seamlessly allocated into different industries just isn't necessarily the case. Since much of the value embedded in a company is organizational knowledge, if that organization and that industry perishes, it's not easy to reclaim that knowledge or that industrial base. Once a country loses an industry to international competition, it's likely gone, as the US has seen in display technologies, certain advanced manufacturing technologies. There was an article earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal saying that Dell is selling off all of its manufacturing platforms for semiconductors. So this notion that countries don't compete, only their companies do, we find to be misplaced. Secondly, the authors seek to assess the impacts of globalization in research and development and science and technology to the United States. They spend about 30 pages analyzing the arguments of Samuel Eaton and Jonathan Khartoum, Yale economists, who essentially favor, the authors favor Eaton and Khartoum's analysis that posits that the US has a comparative advantage in science and technology, especially in research and development activities. And that since we have this comparative advantage, we're likely to keep it and benefit from increased global demand in research and development. So this is a very classical point of view of comparative advantage. The US is the most effective, efficient producer and executor of R&D. So as global demand for R&D increases, the United States is likely to benefit. Well, the evidence suggests that this may actually be a risky proposition. Looking at some statistics, from 1998 to 2003, the share of US corporate R&D sites located in the US declined from 59 to 52%. Over the same period of time, the share of US corporate R&D sites located abroad in China and India increased from 8 to 18%. Between 1986 and 2003, the US share of worldwide domestic R&D investment slipped from 46% to 37%. And finally, this assumption that the research and development will stay onshore while manufacturing goes offshore is no longer a safe assumption. So there's been a theory that, well, we can lose the manufacturing, and that's okay because the United States and other Western economies can migrate up the value chain and focus on higher margin activities, such as research and development, finance, design, support, installation, servicing for manufactured devices that are created elsewhere. But this is no longer a risky, this is no longer a safe assumption. And the reason why is that as you look at various technology life cycles, you find that at the beginning stages of a new technology life cycle, much of the knowledge about that new technology is passive in nature. So it's contained locally at perhaps an R&D plant. So, or at an R&D research facility. So if you look at the case of what happened with Intel recently, and their decision to invest a $4 billion manufacturing plant for the production of their new 64-bit microprocessor in Israel instead of in the United States, was that you found that Intel's research and development into this microprocessor had occurred in Israel. they had taken advantage of very strong R&D tax credits that the Israeli government provides. And so the R&D occurred there. And then when Intel went to make their decision of where to base the manufacturing plant, they decided to put it in Israel because it could be closest to the source of tacit knowledge about the new technology. So what you find is that in subsequent technology life cycles, this theory is inverted. So now first we lose the research and development to offshoring, and then we lose the manufacturing. From a methodological perspective, we find that the report actually underemphasizes and underreports what are in fact some very worrying results. And we'll take this by looking at various components of the US science and technology base. With regard to R&D expenditures, the authors assert that other nations or regions are not significantly outpacing the United States in research and development expenditures. Now, certainly this remains true that the United States has the greatest amount of R&D expenditures in the world. However, when you look at the data that RAND actually provides, you see several worrying trends. First is that whereas US total R&D investment represented an increasing share of global R&D from 1993 to about 1998, represented here, the US share has been weakening since then. And in fact, the US share of worldwide domestic R&D investment, as I said earlier, has declined 9 points over the last 17 years. Focusing on R&D expenditures, however, is not the key metric for assessing countries' international comparisons. That key metric is R&D intensity, which is the percent of money that a country invests in research and development as a percentage of its GDP. This is by far the more important metric. And when we look at the author's analysis of where the United States stands in R&D intensity, at first, the authors present data that seems to tell a pretty good story. So here the United States is this dotted blue line, and you see that in this comparison of international countries, well, we're pretty close to the top. And the authors say that their exact quote is, US R&D intensity compared to international competitors is actually quite strong. Well, again, when we look at recent trends, we see some very disturbing trends. First of all, we find that, well, Japan's been ahead of us for quite a long time. And moreover, South Korea here in orange has recently passed us. But moreover, we find that almost all countries on this chart exhibit increasing trends of research and development intensity, whereas US levels have actually decreased and then flattened out. So while other countries become more focused on this topic, it seems that US performance has been flat over this period of time. And in fact, when we look at more recent rankings from the OECD in 2006, we find that the United States actually places only 22nd out of 29 OECD countries in the fraction of GDP devoted to non-defense R&D. So looking at facts that aren't necessarily included in the report and current trends would perhaps lead you to a different conclusion about the quality of US R&D intensity than reporting of the RAND report has led us to believe. Finally, the RAND report underemphasizes the importance of the decrease in federal R&D funding. So the authors note that from 1954 to 2004, the average rate of increase in US federal R&D funding was 3.5%. But if you look at just the past 10 years, that rate of increase has declined to 2.5%. So nobody argues that there has been a slowdown in federal United States funding for research and development. But the authors tell us not to be concerned about that fact because corporate R&D will supplant and compensate for weakening US federal R&D. So they make the case that really federal R&D only accounts for about 30% of aggregate US research and development. In 2004, that amount was $86 billion, out of a total $288 billion. But in fact, there's perhaps not reason to be so sanguine that corporate R&D will compensate for federal R&D. Looking at the years from 1993 to 2003, we find that corporate-funded R&D investment as a share of GDP fell in the United States by 7%, while in Europe it increased by 3%, and in Japan it increased by 9%. Other statistics show that from 1991 to 2003, the increase in corporate basic and applied research fell by 3% and 4% respectively. And what this also doesn't address is the fact that corporate R&D tends to focus on the D part and not the R part. And increasingly, if the US wishes to be competitive in advanced technologies like nanotechnology or biotechnology, we can't rely on individual corporations to provide the funding for basic scientific research, because no single corporation acting independently or even as part of a research consortium is capable of delivering that level of scientific discovery by themselves. Finally, on this point, US corporate profits, so the profits of US corporations, were 2.6% in 2007. US corporate profits in 2008 in this weak economic environment are expected to be 2.8% at best. Eke out more than 3% in profits over the past 2 years. They're clearly under financial duress. And what we often find is that when companies are squeezed for money, one of the first places they tighten their belts is in R&D. So the author's assertion that we should be sanguine about corporate R&D supplanting federal R&D, we do not believe is a safe one. Finally, on the point of research and development, even the authors concede that the low level of funding for the physical sciences going on in the US right now raises the possibility that they are being underfunded, with ramifications including that the United States' premier position in condensed matter and material physics is in jeopardy. Looking at the author's analysis of US shares of world science and technology publications, including the share of the 1% most cited publications, we find, again, disturbing evidence. So in the US share, in the US share of world science and technology publications, we find that from 1993 to 2001, US performance has actually slipped here, and that the US has ceded its leading position in the world share of science and technology publications to the EU 15. Looking at the share of citations of science and technology publications, we find again that US performance has slipped in the years 1991 to 2003. And when we look at the US share of the top 1% most cited science and technology publications, we find, again, that the US performance has slipped over those periods of time. Moreover, at a meager 1.1% growth rate in share of most cited science and technology publications, the US's performance is half the world average and well below key competitors in Japan and the EU 15. So here's a case in the report where there's actually quite worrisome evidence, and the authors just do not seem to ascribe a significant amount of concern to these statistics. With regard to US education and academic performance in science and technology, K through 12, the authors, I would say here, probably don't find anything different than what we would expect. In fact, while US annual expenditures on K through 12 education are the second highest in the world, the results clearly are not. So, the US 15-year-olds ranked 24th in mathematics literacy and 19th in science literacy out of 29 OECD countries in the 2006 PISA program for international student assessment. even the authors concede that the relatively poor performance of US students has been a persistent aspect of the US education system going back to 1964, and there's been little improvement over the past 3 decades. In general, the authors note that US students are behind foreign peers as they enter more advanced collegiate courses in science and technology. And they note that we're not as well prepared in the United States for careers in science and engineering, and that the long-term pipeline for domestic science and technology talent in the United States is quite strained. With regard to science and engineering graduates, RAND's data clearly shows that the US lags peer countries in the growth of science and engineering graduates. There are a number of reports, and some of the data is contested about what the true number of first university degrees in science and engineering are between China, Europe, and the US because of different accounting and calculation systems. That said, even the authors find that regardless of the differences in the numbers reported, various sources consistently find that the EU and China do in fact graduate more scientists than the United States does. That's just an established fact. Looking at the graduate and PhD levels, we find that 60% of engineering PhDs awarded in the United States go to foreigners. We find that the number of engineering doctorates awarded by US universities to US citizens dropped by 23% from 1966 to 2006. And we find that the US share of the global output of doctorates in science engineering declined from 52% to 22%, a 30% drop in the 17-year period between 1986 to 2003. Indeed, whereas 30 years ago, the United States ranked 3rd among developed nations in the percentage of college students receiving science and engineering degrees, today the United States has fallen to 17th in mathematics and science engineering degrees. The implications of this are that this translates directly into an increased reliance of foreign-born science and engineering talent in the US workforce. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing. It is a wonderful strength of the US innovation system that it has been able to attract talented foreigners to bring their ideas into the land of economic opportunity that the United States afford. You may have seen the Bill Gates quote, who said that for every H-1B visa issued to a foreign engineer, that has created 5 jobs for US citizens. So, with regard to the US science and engineering workforce, the authors reinforce these findings, noting that the percentage of non-US citizens in the science and engineering workforce doubled from 6% to 12% between 1995 and 2006, and that when you look at the youngest cohorts of science of engineers, ages 21 to 35, you find that 20% of them are in fact foreign-born. So the authors come to the obvious conclusion that the US is likely to be worse off if foreign access to US graduate education and science and engineering jobs is limited. Well, in fact, that is exactly what is happening. So that the US has become increasingly dependent on a foreign-born science and technology workforce at precisely the same time it has severely restricted the immigration of talented labor into the US workforce. Now, the authors say that this is a situation that bears some attention. We would argue that this is a clear and present danger and an urgent concern with regard to the state of US science and technology competitiveness. The report fails to include certain key measures. So when we look at US patent activity, The Economist breathlessly reported that the United States accounts for 38% of industrialized nations' triadic patents in 2003. Patents being a proxy for US strength in science and technology. And when you look at their charts, they're really quite impressive, this US spike in patents in 2003. But if we looked at this chart and said that this provides the final analysis for where patent activity occurs in the world, I think we would be sorely mistaken. even the authors concede that many of the patents they're citing are business method or business model patents. So they say that the large increase in triadic patents from 1993 to 2003 could reflect increased use of patents as part of legal and business strategies. So many of these patents are fundamentally unrelated to true scientific and technical discovery. They're business model and business method patents. In fact, nearly 60% of the patents filed with the US PTO in the field of information technology now originate from Asia. So if you look at their chart, you might say, wow, when we combine Russia, China, and Korea, they account for less than 4% of the world's combined patent activity. When you look at patents in terms of triadic patents, that's what the analysis would show you. Now, triadic patents are a useful metric because they combat the home advantage bias that if you just look at the number of patents filed within the home country, that tends to overrepresent the percentage of the population. But I think a more accurate, or at least a different analysis of patent activity would find that the US is not necessarily in the lead. So if you go to the World Intellectual Property Organization, their 2008 report assesses patent grants by country of origin and the share of countries in total patent grants. And here they place Japan ahead of the United States on both metrics. Now, I'm not going to argue that one set of metrics is more correct than the other, but I am going to say that by not including differentiating or contrasting metrics in the report, RAND has kind of over-presented the prodigiousness of US patent activity as a measure for US strength in science and technology. Finally, the report fails to include other key metrics that would represent a differing picture of US economic competitiveness as a consequence of US performance in science and technology, including, you won't find in the report an analysis that the US has persisted in running a current account deficit of $700 billion over the past 4 years, that it runs a $53 billion deficit in advanced technology products. Now, the advanced technology products category isn't simple high-tech equipment like cell phones and DVD recorders. This advanced technology products category includes nuclear technology, optoelectronics, biotechnology. This is new and cutting-edge fields that the US is presumed to have a lead in. In fact, we're running a trade deficit in those fields. And it ignores the fact that in 2009, the US will see its status as the world's largest manufacturer, a position it has held for more than a century. The final point would be that the author's use of time series data, generally covering the years 1993 to 2003, are incapable of accurately reflecting the competitive environment as it exists today in 2008. So the ability to perform and the reality of intensive R&D offshoring has really arisen post-2000. A number of countries have implemented competitiveness strategies and innovation programs since 2005. China in 2006 launched a 15-year program for development of science and technology. So the competition has only stiffened in the years since the data in this report covers. So in conclusion, the United States does continue to lead the world in science and technology competitiveness, as the report confirms. But that's not the real question. The real question is the United States taking significant measures to maintain that lead in the face of trends that clearly show a weakening in our leads in key elements of science and technology and more aggressive international competition? Previous challenges to US science and technology preeminence were real, and they were met head-on with proactive science and technology policies that have been instrumental in sustaining the United States' leading position. The challenges are real, and evidence is showing up in the forms of trade deficits, loss of manufacturing leadership, and reduced levels of economic growth. The US government should take an active role in safeguarding US science and technology leadership and keeping it at least on par, if not ahead, of other advanced and developing countries. And calls for concern about US S&T competitiveness are in fact valid, and the overall impetus to put in place national competitiveness and innovation strategies are not just warranted, but required. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We're going to turn it over to Kent, but I was remiss in pointing out a key factor, which when I started, I should have done, is when we initially proposed this meeting, we invited RAND actually to present their point of view. We didn't just want to have this be us talking about the report, not letting them defend their analysis. They chose not to. They saw the report and they chose not to respond. So, okay, please, somebody, if you could, somebody come and sit up here so there's more room for me to come in. I'm going to apologize for the lack of chairs. There's 2 meetings here, but there's 1 chair up here. So if somebody wants to just take it, don't worry, just come on up and grab it. Ken.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to mention that Rob has given us 8 minutes to make our comments, and he indicated that he had a new and innovative way of enforcing that 8 minutes. So he didn't say what it was, but I'll try to. I'd like just to say a brief word about how the innovation system works, how the world works, talk a little bit about where we are in R&D, comment on education, say actually a couple nice things about the RAND report, and then give a very brief summing up. Well, one of the things I really liked about Stephen and Rob's paper is they really focused on the underlying assumptions about how the economy works, how the innovation system works. I particularly like the way they put an emphasis on what happened in the 1980s in response to Japan. Too often today you read a newspaper article by someone who did not cover that era, and they'll say, well, gee, we thought Japan was a threat, but somehow it just went away. It really ignores how much changed in terms of public policy and how much changed in terms of private practice as well, as companies themselves innovated to meet the Japanese challenge. They talked usefully, I thought, about the ecosystem of innovation, path dependence, national strategies. I think particularly there was a lack of emphasis in the RAND report on the reality of national strategies. You might say that it may still be true, despite bioengineering, that only God can create a tree, but certainly an awful lot of countries can create a comparative advantage. And in fact, most countries have adopted a strategy to do just that, in many cases imitating the system that's grown up here, not so much by design, but as a product of a series of sometimes independent initiatives. I think that I'll get to talking about being a fast follower. There wasn't enough in the RAND report talking about, I think, the interaction of innovation and having a manufacturing and vibrant and innovative service base. There was a danger of slipping into what some people call Gertrude Stein economics, that a dollar is a dollar is a dollar, whether it turns from one type of chip or the microprocessor. I really do think that the idea that countries do not compete is wrong. Certainly companies compete, but that competitiveness of the companies is tied to regional and national innovation systems, and you really have to look at what's the national lab doing, what's the federal government funding in universities, how these are translated into the form that can then be usefully used by a company. I thought they did a nice job, the ITIF team did, in talking about some of the emerging new thinking in economics. I think in their next paper they might even go further, that strategic trade, which emerged as a doctrine in the 1980s, is in part what we're still talking about today. There's behavioral economics, there's a new institutional economics. I think Rob's neo-Schumpeterian, or really innovation economics, is something that needs to be emphasized and even more completely explored. In terms of R&D, I thought that the ITIF comments were on target, that the federal share has been declining. It's been tilted toward life sciences. Much, as Stephen suggested, is tied to defense R&D, which in many cases do not translate into the civilian economy. The private sector emphasis is certainly true, in that about 2/3 of R&D is now done by the private sector. but that private sector is not only moving toward the D, but quite explicitly moving away from basic research. Recently was a public announcement by Bell Labs that they're no longer doing basic research. It really confirms a trend that's been going on for some time. And as corporate labs have become more decentralized, they've moved further away from the sources of underlying and basic innovation, the universities and the national laboratories. All of which says that, in my view, as important as the private sector R&D is, it's not a substitute for that investment in more basic research. In terms of education and the workforce, I think the world is changing in several ways. That we have the U.S. ever since certainly the rise of fascism in Europe benefited enormously from a wave of immigrant talent of all kinds, and certainly heavily represented in the S&T area. Now for the first time we face two kinds of competition for that talent. First of all, the OECD countries have seen how we've benefited from that, and they're attempting to move in a similar direction. I knew it was serious when I heard that a French lab had actually changed its common language to English so they could attract Chinese and Indian talent. In addition, the home countries, the sending countries, which have been more recently heavily represented by China and India, are beginning to offer opportunities in the home country that are very attractive. So there's certainly, it's plausible to think that a higher percentage of that talent that used to stay may now be returning home. From a security point of view, there is, of course, the concern about so-called deemed exports and the question of the desire by a number of government laboratories to have people who are, in fact, U.S. citizens. The element that RAND talks about and many others talk about, of course, is that to some extent wages are a good proxy about whether or not we're meeting the demand. And many people would say, well, gee, there hasn't been a dramatic increase in the salaries for S&T professionals. And I think that that snapshot misleads what I suspect are going to be the trends, not only from the competition around the world for foreign-born talent, but the fact that the Sputnik-inspired generation is now reaching or really entering retirement age. The question is, who's going to take those places? Third, I think if you look at the 21st century challenge, they are heavily research dependent. You're looking at challenges in energy, in security, in agriculture, in water, that are really going to demand an expanded S&T capacity. And furthermore, you have to think beyond the scientist and engineer to the quality of the S&T workforce, the lab assistant, what we used to think of a machinist, who really is thinking about how to redesign a part of the assembly line. All of that kind of skill requires a better math science background in the K-12 schools than we are currently providing. Both comment on the H-1B reality. I think that you certainly hear anecdotes. Microsoft moving to Vancouver. I heard the head of the Nano Lab from HP a couple years ago saying that of the last 40 people he'd hired, the last 30 people he'd hired, 29 were immigrants. He couldn't get them here. He'd simply move the lab. So that situation is real. On the other hand, I think we have to deal with the double pressure on people choosing S&T careers from the outsourcing reality. Alan Blinder, in my view, gives a conservative estimate of 30 million professionals who will find their specialties now subject to international competition, and there is a tension between the H-1B and the long-term desire to have more Americans in this field. Well, just a nice word about RAND. I think they have some interesting ideas that we ought to look at. Interesting, it's an important analysis targeted at the Department of Defense, and they raise the question about how we can be a fast follower. Japan did very well. They don't really emphasize that as Japan got to the production possibility frontier, as economists talk about, they really switched to emphasizing more basic research themselves, and they benefited from a country like ourselves that did not have a national strategy. Finally, the difference of view has to do with the use of the word crisis or imminent. And I think you could say that we don't really face an imminent crisis in the sense that we're going to see a dramatic decline next year. On the other hand, I want to quote Charlie Schultz, who was served under President Carter's Council of Economic Advisors, Lyndon Johnson's OMB, and was famous for saying that the problem with the deficits is that they are not a wolf at the door, but they're termites in the woodwork. And I think if we don't pay attention to the termites, there may not be a door left by the time the wolf shows up.
Thank you, Rob. Today actually marks a significant anniversary for me. September the 10th, 2008. It was exactly 27 years ago.
Mike, can you talk a little louder for people in the back, please?
Right. It was exactly 27 years ago that I showed up in Washington to join the Commerce Department as counselor to the Secretary of Commerce, who was then Mac Baldrige. And I remember that day because I remember walking into Mac's office and, here I am, Mr. Secretary, what's my job? And he said, Clyde, your job is to reduce the trade deficit. Right. In September 1981, the U.S. trade deficit was $27 billion annually. And everyone said it was unsupportable, couldn't last, had to be fixed. Japan accounted for the biggest part of that. I had spent some time in Japan, and so Mac told me, Clyde, you got to get after the Japanese and get this trade deficit fixed. Okay, so I said, by the way, what do I get paid for this? And I forgot what the number was, but I remember it was a much less than my wife and kids had become accustomed to. And I mentioned this to Mac, and he said, not to worry. He was a businessman himself. He understood entrepreneurial spirit. The Commerce Department would make a deal with me. They pay me a bonus, 10% of the amount by which I reduce the trade deficit. So by 1985, I owed Mac Baldrige $15 billion. And I had to get into some other line of work. This is a long story. Just to stay with the numbers for a moment, in 1981, when we counted the trade deficit, we counted only goods. And so that $27 billion was goods. And then as time went by, the number got very large. And sometime in the mid-'80s, I forget exactly when it was, somebody said, look, we also have services, imports and exports. And it happened that at the time we had a significant surplus in our services trade. And somebody said, we really should report services and goods together because services are exports after all. Fair enough. But on top of that, if we report them together, the number will shrink. And so sometime in the late 80s, we began reporting goods and services, and sure enough, the trade deficit shrank for a couple of years. But then by the early 90s, the trade deficit numbers getting big again. And at that point, somebody said, but we're really good in science and technology. Our comparative advantage is really high tech. We gotta kind of change the way we report to put some focus on the fact that our comparative advantage is high tech, and we're really doing well in high tech. And so again, we changed the counting system, and we came up with a category of trade called advanced trade and advanced technology. And we began to break those numbers out separately and report them separately. And I have a chart. Unfortunately, I don't have it big enough for you to see. But what it shows is that we began doing this, looks like about 1989. Anyhow, sure enough, we had a trade surplus in advanced technology trade. And we had that surplus until 2001. And then, as Rob and others have said, I guess this year that's going to be something like a $60 or $70 billion trade deficit. So for a long time there has been this trend of declining competitiveness, of rising trade deficits in a number of these areas. And throughout that time, the commentary has been characterized by some of the comments that were highlighted here. Countries don't compete. Companies compete, but countries don't compete. Another mantra has been that as globalization proceeds, that we're moving to higher ground, and that as some industries move abroad, lower technology, medium technology industries are outsourced, not to worry because we're moving to higher ground. We're going to do the technology, the design, the investment banking, right? And the high value-added stuff, while the lower value-added stuff moves abroad. There has been, of course, the potato chips, computer chips kind of analysis, which many economists deny making that statement, but if they didn't make it, it accurately captures a point of view that has driven a lot of policy making. Now, underlying this commentary and what I think has been a long-term denial of an adverse trend for the U.S. Has been an economic theory, an economic orthodoxy. We call it neoclassical economics, which goes back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo and focuses on comparative advantage. Ricardo's great innovative idea about what drives trade. And I don't want to say Ricardo is wrong, because he's not wrong within the context of the time in which he was operating and within the assumptions that bound that theory. But when people talk about potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? They're all chips. When people talk about companies compete but countries don't compete, when somebody like Greg Mankiw says that outsourcing is good for the U.S. economy, that outsourcing of services is just like trade and any other product, and it's good for the U.S. economy. Behind those statements are certain assumptions. And among those assumptions is that economies of scale are not active. That technology, capital, and labor don't move across national boundaries. That substantial changes in technological development and productivity don't have an effect on trade patterns. Now, when Ricardo dreamed up comparative advantage, he was living in a world of commodity trade. And in fact, U.S. trade, if you look at the numbers, U.S. trade was pretty much commodity trade until really the 1970s. And so those concepts had a certain practical applicability. In today's world, they don't. They do not. And interestingly, although Paul Krugman was quoted accurately as saying companies compete, countries don't compete, in fact, it was Paul who became famous, who became the, Bates Clark awardee, the guy, the top economist under the age of 40. And he got that award for coming up with the concept of strategic trade. And in his writing in the early 1980s, it was Paul who said, hey, you know, the trade behavior is not, it's increasingly diverging from, the picture you really see is divergent from the picture that the theory says you ought to see. And why did Paul say that? He said that because he said, hey, you know, there are economies of scale. There is technological change. There is imperfect competition. And under those circumstances, the trade behavior is different. Countries do compete under those circumstances. Think Boeing and Airbus, for example. And so that kind of critique of neoclassical economics has been around for a long time. Many economists downplayed it in the 80s. Paul himself downplayed it in the 80s and early 90s. And mainly because the argument was, hey, if we have strategic trade, we have to have an industrial policy. And if we have an industrial policy, that'll mean government will pick winners and losers, and the special interests will control that. And that'll be worse than if we just have free trade. And so the grip of neoclassical economics remained firmly in place. I would argue that we did not meet the Japanese competition. We have not met the competition from Asia. Yes, the Japanese economy hit a wall at a macro level, but what companies are eating up the U.S. auto market? It's still Toyota and Honda and the Japanese producers. Who's dominating semiconductor equipment manufacture and a broad range of other electronics? It's still the Japanese companies. We didn't meet that competition. We took various measures to ameliorate the problems, but we didn't meet the competition. And so I would argue that we are deeper in the hole than we were before. The game has gotten much more serious. The numbers are getting worse. Our position is weaker. And we're not going to deal with it. We will not deal with this problem unless we address this fundamental theoretical economic discontinuity between the theory and the reality. Thank you.
Well, Clyde basically just gave us a great commercial for this conference we're doing on September 25th, so thank you. No, seriously, and Kent alluded to it too, this whole notion of economic doctrines and this notion of innovation economics. I would commend to you to look at the the forthcoming issue of Business Week. I think it'll hit the newsstands tomorrow night or be nailed out tomorrow night. Mike Mandel has a very, very good story in that about these competing economic doctrines, neoclassical, Keynesian, what is now this emerging innovation economics, and what that implies for a whole set of issues. We've also got a report, which will probably be going up on our website probably Friday, which goes into that about how these economic doctrines are shaping policy. And lastly, I would encourage you all to go to innovationeconomics.org, which is our other website, and take a pretty fun test. It's Find Your Economic Type. Take this test. It takes about 10 hours to take it. It takes about 10 minutes, and up pops at the end. You either picture Art Laffer if you're a supply sider, Bob Rubin if you're Rubinomics, Keynes, or Joseph Schumpeter. So I know what Clyde, I know these guys are going to be, but you never know. So I encourage you to take that test, innovationeconomics.org. So thank you for those great comments. We've got about 20, 25 minutes, so why don't we take some questions or comments from the audience. If you could identify yourself, try to keep your questions short, we'll try to keep the answers short and get as many people. I see a hand back here, ma'am.
Debbie Stein, Director of Service. I have one thing which I was actually at the meeting, the RAND meeting.
Can I actually ask you to speak a little louder?
Okay. Yeah, I was actually at the RAND meeting 2 or 3 years ago, whenever it was held that the report was based on. And I read the RAND report, I don't know, whenever it came out, December or something. One thing that you did not talk about, but was quite discussed a great deal at the meeting, was I'll call the Michael Teitelbaum argument, which I imagine you guys know, which is that companies all these companies are making false promises to students. There's, they're saying get these science engineering degrees, but there won't be jobs. That's been now emphasized also by the Urban Institute report. I just looked quickly through your report. It looks like you have about a paragraph or two on it, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the demand side. In other words, will there be jobs for, if these kids do pursue science engineering degrees, will there be jobs for those?
I tried to allude to that when I talked about our salaries rising rapidly. It's another point that Michael makes, and you do go back to the Sputnik era, and one of the things that was striking was not only was interest kindled among many people chose to pursue then scientific careers even though it wasn't aerospace, but also the demand was there. And my comments about the Sputnik generation retiring, the new challenges that we face, and the fact that we face foreign competition for the talent upon which we're dependent, all suggest to me that if you look at the movie we're going to make, rather than the snapshot we're taking today, that in fact the demand will be there.
Yes, sir.
Does that respond, Debbie, at all? Or?
Well, I've always on the continuing look for quantitative data, and I'm just wondering if anybody can look at quantitative data.
Just a comment there. Dick Elkis has a new book out called Winner Take All, and in that book he has a chapter that pertains to that subject exactly, and talking about the weakness on the demand side and the disconnect between the message that students are receiving and kind of the resources that universities are putting in place and the demand from companies. So check it out.
I think the short answer is you have to do supply and demand at the same time. If you only do one, it's not going to work. Yes, sir.
I'm Victor Bass, a consultant in national security policy. I would like to put this discussion in the context of the future. Let's face it, the United States is declining as a superpower. It is China within 6 years in GDP will be higher than the United States. The only area, so the same is true except longer for India. So we are bound to go down economically. The only area where we can compete and be number one is science and technology. So my answer is, let's minimize and forget about Iraq's, fighting Iraq's and so on and so forth. Put all that money into R&D, into science and technology, and be number one there. And our criteria should not be comparing one category with another category in another nation, but double and triple that. That is, if we want to maintain our relationship and be number one in the world. So I would like comments from Clyde, Kent, and Stephen on that subject.
Anybody wants to
Okay, well, let me jump in. Let me address the previous question just quickly if I can, because I think it's a serious issue. I think that the notion that if we just spend more on educating scientists and engineers, and if we just graduate more scientists and engineers, that'll solve our problem, I think is badly flawed. What I have seen in my research is that that the production and increasingly the R&D is moving abroad. And it's moving abroad for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the overvalued dollar. And a second one is investment incentives. Someone mentioned the Intel decision to put a major facility in Israel. Well, part of that may have been the existence of talent in Israel. But a big part of it was that the Israeli government is putting up half the cost. You do your discounted cash flow. So what does that mean? That means that you got a big facility going to hire a lot of people in Israel. So you graduate these engineers in Silicon Valley, but the factory's in Israel. And unless we address that problem, I don't think that just educating more engineers is going to solve our problem. On this issue of U.S. relative decline, I think it's true. I mean, that the U.S. Cannot, and in my view, should not want to strive to kind of maintain the biggest GDP in the world. We don't have the biggest population. So naturally, if China and India and the rest of the world begin to achieve economic growth, the relative weight of the U.S. is going to decline. But the real issue here is not, are we the biggest economy in the world, but do we have the living standard the optimal living standard that we can achieve? Do our kids have the opportunity to achieve a high living standard, and do we have the power and resources to protect our interests? And I think it's instructive to look at countries like Switzerland or the Netherlands or Belgium, small countries, but they remain quite influential. They have a high living standard, they remain quite powerful, and they do it because they specifically address the issues of competitiveness. They do have industrial policies. Think Singapore, for pity's sake. 3.5 million people, that's way above its weight because it has systematically adopted competitiveness strategy. The issue for us is not how do we remain #1 in GDP, but how do we manage our position in a world in which inevitably we're going to be relatively less of a weight.
Let me get back to Dave Golson. Dave, you should also mention, or I'll mention it, Dave is on ITI and board member as well.
I wasn't sure how I'd identify myself, so
That's all you need to say.
So I agree with this thrust of everything that's said, but I wanted to ask about 3 statements Steve made that seem at least open to question by people more skeptical than I. One is you simply asserted that R&D intensity was the important measure, not the level of investment, and it doesn't strike me why that's obvious. The U.S. actually has a lot more cash going into these things. Why is it actually that an important measure? Secondly, the 3.5% versus 2.5% growth in federal spending during those different periods. I mean, if we look at some of the things going on in that earlier period, Apollo, big defense investments in development, I'm not sure if those 2 figures actually are so obvious in their implications, is what you said. And third, I couldn't see the slide, but you said that U.S. has had a problem in terms of education achievement since 1964, which would seem to me to raise questions, A, about how well did NDEA, which we like to cite, actually work, and B, how important a metric is that if we've been bad since 1964, but obviously everything else hasn't been going down in line with that. So you just talk about those 3 metrics and why you think they tell the story you want to tell.
Sure. Certainly, aggregate R&D expenditures are an important metric, but that can have the effect of overemphasizing the inherent size of economy. So that it's important to have an ability, when you're doing international comparisons, to make a relative assessment of the percentage amount of money that a country is spending on R&D as a share of its GDP. I mean, you might say that my family and yours spends the same amount on food, but if I have 10 people in my family and you have 4 in yours, the quality of life is going to be quite different. So the relative size matters to a significant degree.
It's more like comparing how much we invest in growing food than eating food.
But both measures certainly bear analysis, and I think the facts that even the RAND authors present show a weakening on an international comparative basis in both R&D expenditure and R&D intensity. With regard to your comment about the percentages the authors cite, my reason for presenting those specific factors in the presentation were that one of the reasons the authors said that we can feel sanguine about corporate R&D compensating for decreased federal R&D was that when you looked at the increase in corporate R&D intensity from 1953 to 2004, it was at 5.4%, and over the last 10 years it was at 5.3%. So that performance is inconsistent and strong. But when you look at the comparative measure for federal funding, you actually do see, a substantial increase of an entire percentage point. And I think we can all agree that there has been a slowdown in overall federal R&D funding, and as even the authors concede, the fact that so much of it has recently been allocated to life sciences and biotechnology has the effect of crowding out other fields, like the physical and material sciences. And your third query was about?
education since 1964.
Sure.
The slide I told you to take out.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the authors don't take a definitive position on that subject, but within the text of the report, they do cite those who would make arguments to say, well, you know, this underperformance of U.S. students in math and science, yes, has been a persistent aspect of our educational system since 1954. And in fact, you know, our economy hasn't experienced any ill effects during that time. In fact, the authors quote Roger Pilkey, a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, who says, yeah, actually the United States has done quite well over that period of time. So there's, no reason to feel suspect about this linkage of math and science performance and educational performance. I think we would argue that as an increasing amount of economic activity becomes knowledge-based, as opposed to trade and commodity goods like Clyde spoke about, the importance of education rises all the more. And this argument that Pilkey and the authors make that, well, yeah, in fact, the U.S. economy has done quite well, I think is also subject to interpretation. As we said, we have the highest unemployment rate at this point that we've had in the last 6 years, $53 billion deficit in advanced technology products, we're $700 billion current account deficit. I think there is a certain very real percentage of Americans who might say, well, the economy hasn't really done as well for me as you might think is the case.
Could I just add a quick
Sure.
comment on that? But immigration has compensated, of course, because we haven't had the Americans that are trained. That for part of that period we had relatively little international competition, so it really wasn't a test. And furthermore, one of the strengths we really do have is the flexibility that's supported by the community colleges. So some of the people that come out of school inadequately prepared do find their way back into a better preparation in a way that is not common in other competing countries.
I think, Kim, what you're saying is that to a very real degree, the U.S. has compensated to a large degree for the shortcoming of its own citizenry in math and science and S&P technology skills by importing foreign talent. And that's been a very strong aspect of our national innovation system. The point we're making that I believe the authors understate is that if that flow of foreign talent and foreign graduate students is going to be severely restricted because of U.S. policies, and if you look at H-1 visas, we find that you have a 7-year backlog for 1 million people, and only 65,000 individuals can get H-1B visas in a year, then that problem is only going to exacerbate the state of U.S. S&T competitiveness.
I'd also cite Howard Weil's book, New Rules for New Economy, where Howard makes the very compelling case that and actually we cite another really interesting analytical study in here that makes the same argument mathematically, that you can go onto a low road path with low skills, sort of do okay, but your production processes are organized to take advantage of low skills, not high skills. We can go with this gentleman right here who had his hand up.
Mark Tucker. I want to follow up, if I may, on the first question. About a dozen years ago, my elder son, who was at the time an advanced chip designer for Xerox in Palo Alto, called me. He said he had just learned that joining his work team were a number of Chinese engineers who were in China and would continue to be in China because they could participate in his work team through the internet. He said they made a quarter of what he made. They did exactly the same work that he did, and they did it as well as he and his colleagues did it. And he was asking me whether he had chosen the wrong occupation. And my question is this. In that situation, which I take to be rather widespread right now, why should American employers raise their wages enough to attract a lot of American kids into my son's occupation when they can get the same skills at prevailing wages elsewhere? And adding to that, which was also on my son's mind at the time, if in fact the manufacturing is going overseas because it's cheaper to do there, and if manufacturers of high-tech devices understand that propinquity, that is with respect to locating R&D near manufacturing, is a good idea, isn't that an additional reason why they should locate R&D overseas? Why will they want to raise the wages enough to create the demand, which we all acknowledge is necessary if we create the supply?
Really great comment and question. I think the answer is there's not a direct answer to that. I think on the one hand, one phenomenon that we're facing that again has not been encompassed in the theoretical thinking about this. For a long time, we had this notion in our heads that developing countries had a lot of unskilled labor, and they would be, it was cheap labor because it was unskilled, and they would do the low-tech stuff, and we would do the high-tech stuff. But what we're facing, of course, are countries like China and India. They do have a lot of unskilled labor, but they got big populations, and so 5–10% of a billion people is still a lot of people, and they're highly skilled. And they can do what your son can do, and they can do it for 10–15 cents on the dollar. And I think the challenge there is the following. That cost gap is enormous, but it is exacerbated by the fact that China manages the value of its currency. It manages its currency to be undervalued. So if the Chinese currency were properly valued, that Chinese engineer, instead of making a quarter of what your son is making, might be making 50% of what your son is making. Then the way the global system is working at the moment, the Chinese authorities in the industries you're talking about are constantly leaning on foreign companies like Xerox. And it's a subtle leaning. It's, you're here in China, shouldn't you be a good Chinese citizen and show your dedication to the development of China? And well, you can do that by moving more technology here. And because this is an autocratic government and bureaucrats have real power, that kind of subtle leaning is powerful, and it tends to, there's no counter push. The U.S. Commerce Department is not talking to Xerox and saying, gee, have you thought about how we're going to employ these graduates coming out of MIT? Then there's another factor, which is the tax system. I mentioned Israel's incentives to Intel to put their plant in Israel. China does the same thing. Big capital grants, big tax holidays. Now, in the U.S., of course, the states do that too, but the states have a lot less resources than they don't control federal taxes. And so what I would argue is that if we got serious in the U.S. and there was some counter push, and we matched the financial incentives, and we matched the tax holidays, then I think that you wouldn't stop all of that bleed, but you would stop a lot.
Let me just add that we need to change the overall policy if we had hypothetically a Plaza II Accord, which was going to lead to a balanced current account over, let's say, 5 or 6 years. That suggests that we would be making, say, 700 billion more of something in terms of goods and services here. We don't know exactly what that would be, but it would be certainly more manufacturing and the related services, including the R&D that goes with that. The second, I think we will have to think about developing skills for ourselves and encourage our children and the deans of engineering to think about a mix of skills that are not so easily replicable.
So I'm going to violate my rule and go to 10:35. Just kind of, I think there's some pent-up demand here. So I'm going to go in the order I saw them. So this gentleman right there. And why don't we keep the answers very, very brief? Go ahead, sir.
Will Straw from the Centre for American Progress. Much of the discussion this morning has been on the decline in comparative advantage in manufacturing sectors. I think there's a number of service sector where America retains a comparative advantage, design, branding, financial services to some extent. What case do you think there is for some kind of government intervention or policy to retain that comparative advantage? Or is it the case that there's less of a market failure in the service sector than in the goods sector, and therefore less of a case?
Stephen, why don't you take that one, because you've done all that work in services consulting.
Right. There has been a dramatically increased focus across nations on the importance of services to their economy, and a number of countries from Finland, Germany, Japan, Singapore, Canada are implementing national service innovation programs to make the service sector of their economy more effective. What these countries have found is that there are a number of structural problems with regard to the incentives for service innovation. So, for example, with regard to R&D tax credits, it's really clear in a manufacturing context what research and development is. It occurs in the laboratory. You can get very specific tax credits for it. But with regard to service innovation, where does that inventive step occur? Should Google receive tax credits when it's looking to experiment with a new search algorithm or to build a new information technology platform? So there's been a lot of effort to define what is innovation in the services context and where should it receive preferred R&D tax credits. And as services increasingly rely on information technology, there has been a push, as Rob said, to bring the discipline of science and services and understand the disciplines in information technology, in organizational, in human skills required. So this has become an increasing area of innovation policy. And actually, I think CAP will be releasing shortly a presentation, or at least a part of the presentation focusing on the countries in which in the last 5 years have implemented new national service innovation policies.
I'm Kathy Kingscott from IBM. I just wanted to comment, if I may, on a couple of the points that have been made from the point of view of a global manufacturer and services company. To the point of Debbie's comment about jobs, in our experience, we have about almost 400,000 employees around the world and operate in 165 countries around the world. Jobs go where the skills reside. So today, for instance, we have 70,000 employees in India, which 5 years ago we had maybe 10,000 employees in India. So why do the jobs go to India? They go because the skills reside there, because the infrastructure grows. To the comment around how do you develop the skills that are required, there's a whole new effort going on, to your point, around services, science, management, and engineering curricula that are being developed at a number of universities. Probably over 200 universities around the world are focusing on developing the curricula that enables people to work really at the high end of advanced technology skills and at the high end of communication skills and partnering skills, so that you can really deal with the complex problems that advanced technology can address. And I just want to make another point. I had the opportunity last week to be in Romania and a couple of weeks ago to be in China visiting manufacturing facilities. And I think, so the point that somebody made around the language skills that others have, the language of business and language of science is English. You go around the world and everybody speaks perfect English, and what do Americans speak? You know, we imperfect English, and we certainly don't speak the languages that others are addressing. And so we need, I think, to think through how we're going to develop our skills so we can be highly competitive in the global economy.
One last question. Sorry, Jerry. I'm not
I'll
going
be
to take
back
your
next
question.
time.
Yes, sir. We have one last question.
Okay, so we're in the final months of the Bush administration. So let's look again.
Say who you are.
Ron Carmella, I'm at UMBC. Why again hasn't the Bush administration responded to this issue, crisis?
I think there's an element of nostalgic thinking that it's still actually 1960, that the United States is effortlessly ahead, as it should be. And it's also very much the underlying assumption about how the world does and should work, so that if something needs to be done, we assume that the market is going to take care of it, rather than the more complex view that Stephen and Rob and Clive were articulating, that you need to think about government policy, you need to think about universities, you need to think about the national laboratories, how all of these are, community colleges, how all these are interacting. That doesn't mean that everybody in the Bush administration thinks that way. The President's 2006 State of the Union address, certainly I mentioned the RANDs report, articulated the American Competitiveness Initiative, but I don't, my sense was it was more like dealing with the constituency rather than embracing a new view of how the economy should move forward.
Well, I would, I agree with Kent, but I would make another comment, which is that the Bush administration has not really responded to this question, but neither have the predecessor administration. And I think it's a combination what Kevin and some of us said earlier, that the conventional wisdom here is that we're moving to higher ground. Countries don't compete, and that conventional wisdom has been bolstered by we had the internet bubble in the late '90s, which made the economy look like it was doing great before the bubble collapsed. Then we had the housing bubble, which made the economy look like it was doing great until we ran into subprime. And so there have been what I would say are major distortions in the economy that have clouded the underlying picture and kind of given a justification to what I think has been a misleading doctrine.
I'll answer the question in a different way. On your way out on the table, you will find another ITIF report that is just being released today that compares the current campaign's technology and innovation policies, looking at where Obama and McCain stand on these issues. I think the positive thing is that, at least as far as the platforms are concerned, both Barack Obama and John McCain will focus more attention on technology and innovation policy issues. For example, McCain would make the R&D tax credit permanent at a level that's 10% of the wages that a company spends on R&D. Barack Obama would also make the R&D tax credit permanent and commits to double federal funding to research and development. So take a look at that paper on the way out. Hopefully it portends more follow-through from the next administration on these issues.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and please join me in welcoming and thanking our speakers.